Hello everyone and welcome to part B of Minecraft and Maya Slimes. My name is Casanis, and in the second part of the video we're going to be taking a look at active blend shapes. Active blend shapes are an extremely interesting topic. It allows you to create a lot of different and interesting things. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you go back and watch part A and that you've created this thing here properly and everything is working as we expected. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our first active blend, or our first active blend that we're going to be using within the blend shape itself. We'll start with a squash. It's actually pretty simple to do. I'm just going to move it slightly off to the side so you can see it. With it selected, with the object selected, we've got our squash object selected. I'm going to go to the animation module here, and I'm going to go to create deformers. We've used this before when creating a blend shape, but now we're going to go over blend shape and we're going to go to non-linear deformers. And these objects here allow you to actually manipulate the mesh in some way with, as you can see, a bend, a flare, etc. We're going to be using squash, non-linear deformer, squash, bam. When you do so, you're going to end up with this kind of handle that appears inside. If I go across to the channel editor now and their inputs, we can actually see it right here. If I actually manipulate the factor, we can see we're getting a squash and a stretch in this guy here, and it's maintaining volume, and that's the whole point. I want this cube to maintain volume. You want to make sure that as it expands, the middle gets squishy, and as it hits the ground, that the bottom squashes out. Now we've got ourselves a little problem here. We're designing this guy here to be able to hop up and down as if his bottom surface is hitting the ground. So I really want the squash to occur at the bottom. As right now, if we take a look, panels, orthographic front. If we take a look and we manipulate the factor again, we can see that it's actually squashing and stretching from the middle, and we don't want that. We actually want to be squashing and stretching from the bottom. So it's easily changed. I'm going to make a couple of quick changes over here in the squash. I'm going to go to high bound and I'm going to create this value 2. Just like that. So it's now twice the size of what it was. And then I'm going to go to the transformation down here, or over here, and I'm going to transform this entire thing down like this. So you can see now that I've doubled the size of it, and now what I've also done is I've made sure that because with the entire thing selected, the squash point, the actual squash point is right here at the base of my object. That's what I'm looking to happen. Now watch what happens when I use factor now. When I squash and stretch it now, the base stays in place and everything squashes and stretches from there. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. So now we can go boing, 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 boing. You know, it's going to allow you to do stuff like that, this kind of jello-ish movement. That is our first one. That is our squash. Let's take a look at the second one. The second one is called it's going to be a jiggle. So let's grab this guy over here, make sure we're in object mode, grab this guy over here, and we're going to do something very, very similar. And this one here we're going to be looking at from the side. I'm only going to make this thing jiggle in one direction. You can decide to add more if you want to. Ultimately, I didn't even use this in the animation I created. I ended up using the third thing we're going to create, but let's take a look at it anyway, the jiggle. So with it selected, I'm going to go back in animation, create deformers, and I'm going to go take a look at the nonlinear deformer, the sine wave right here, and I'm going to add it. Bam. And again, once I do so, let's get out of this mode, it's going to create my sine deformer right there. If I click on the input and I actually change the amplitude, you're going to see it does this kind of wiggle jiggle. See that? Wiggle jiggle, wiggle, 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 jiggle, wiggle, wiggle. So that is not so bad. That's not so bad right there. And that's going to allow you to give kind of like a quiver to it. And I'm actually just going to spin it around because I only want it to be going in one direction. So I'm going to rotate the Y 90 degrees. 90, just like that. So I'm going to have it only jiggle backwards and forwards. It doesn't really matter which way you have it jiggle, to be honest, but whatever. I spun it, I'm going to leave it now. So anyway, there is my sine deformer right there. Now there's a couple things we can do. We can see that it's kind of jiggling from the bottom. We can change the wavelength so we get more jiggles. You're not going to get very many more because there's not a whole lot of mesh in here, so you're not going to get a whole lot in there. But you can change the wavelength to like 4 or 3 or whatever, and it's going to change exactly how it works. So now if I do amplitude, it's going to wobble differently. If we make it lower, so from 2 we go down to, let's say, 0.5, and we play with the amplitude, it's going to give it a slightly different jiggle. So you can see that the waveform there is slightly more. There's not anywhere near enough mesh to actually be able to handle anything like this. You'd have to add additional mesh within here and make sure the entire thing is a little bit heavier to make it work as we'd like it. So for now, what if I just leave, what if I leave it at, what if I put it at 2? Sorry, put it back to 2. No, what did we have it at before? Oh, that's the amplitude. Sorry, put this back to, let's try it at 1. That's still way too much. So we're going to just leave it at 2, and we're going to change the amplitude so it's not so much. Like that. And we're going to be able to wiggle it like that. Okay, you can actually play around with this, and if you decide you only want the top to jiggle, well, you can actually change the low bound, and let's say put this at like minus 0.25. And that's just gonna make sure the bottom, see how now the bottom is no longer wiggling, and I've changed the height of that thing there. And when I do the amplitude here, that's still kind of wiggling. I don't like the way that wiggles. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to change my wavelength. You're going to have to start doing stuff like this. You have to start playing with it and make sure you come up with a value that's actually appropriate. Because you don't want the bottom to move. You don't want the bottom to wiggle like that. What happens when we had it at 0 and we had this at 2? Sorry, 2. And I had this back at -1. Was that bottom moving? Was that bottom moving? See, that's not even so bad. You might just leave it like that. That default's not so bad. See how the bottom's not moving at all? And that's what we want. We want the bottom of the guy to be solid. So that gives you a little tiny bit of a shake and a wiggle. You can use that kind of stuff. We're going to adjust this value here in some ways later on. Okay, so let's put this to 0. Bam for now. And we're going to move on to the last one. The last one is going to allow us to shift the entire structure. We want to be able to move parts of this and add a different type of wiggle, and this is the one that I use mostly for my animation. We're going to select the last guy right here. Make sure you're in object mode. Select the last guy right here, which is the mass movement, and we're going to go to edit or create deformers, and we're going to go this time to, instead we're going to go to a lattice. Now when we wrap a lattice around, let's take a look. When we wrap a lattice around, well, first of all, we're going to change some of these values. Actually, no, I like this just the way it is, actually. We've got our lattice here, and the lattice is going to create this box-like thing around our character. And that's going to allow us, by moving these different points, watch what happens. If I actually go in here and I say lattice point, and I drag this, it's going to allow me to move the different parts. So you actually have a lot of different, you have a lot of options here on how this thing's going to move. You could actually do some really interesting stuff with this, but we're going to keep it really simple for demonstration purposes. The next part that I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the lattice itself. I'm going to say lattice point. I'm going to select the lattice point. I'm going to select all the top ones just like this. I'm then going to go to create deformers, and I'm going to choose cluster. And it's going to create this little tiny C on the top. Now what that's going to allow me to do is move all these points at the same time. So you can see I can do that, I can do this, I can move this stuff all around. Kinda cool, kinda cool. Okay, now the last thing we're going to do is we're going to actually do the clusters for each one. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say, I'm going to select the object mode. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say lattice point. I'm going to select these lattice points and I'm going to say create deformers cluster. And the last thing I'm going to do is right click on this thing here, lattice points again, and select all the bottom ones and then say create deformers cluster, just like that. You know, the bottom one is probably, no, actually you're going to want the bottom one too. So yeah, do all 3 of them, and that is going to create for us our simple shapes. And we're going to use these guys here as active blends to actually play around with this guy. Okay. Actually, I'm going to cut it off right here because we're getting kind of close to that time when I'm going to lose something. So I'm going to cut it off right here, and when we come back, we'll actually build the active blend shape. I'll be right back, everyone. Okay, everyone, we are back, and we're going to now create our active blend shape. So it's really easy to do. The first thing I want you to do, though, beforehand is I want you to go to these circles we added on the back, and what I did is I right-clicked, I said Control Vertice, and I dragged up one of these Control Vertices. And that's just so I could indicate the top. So I know this thing here is pointing straight up, and that is the top. We're going to be using these controls to rotate some of the mass of this object, and I want to make sure I can tell by eye if it's very close to the top. Afterwards, once you've moved up one of the Control Vertices, go to Object Mode and select each one and say Modify Freeze Transformation. Just like that, do that for each and every one. 1, 2, 3. Okay? Now we're going to actually add the information to our control system. We've got our active blends, or we've got our target blends up here and created. We want to make sure that our guy down here is actually controlling these active blend shapes. So let's grab onto our control interior. Remember, we added the squash and the jiggle before. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our window, and we're going to go to, no, sorry, we're going to go to animate, and we're going to go to set driven key, and we're going to say set. And that's going to open up this new window. And basically what we want to do is make sure that this guy here is driving the squash and stretch of this thing here. So let's go to make sure that this, first of all, control interior, you've selected it. You're going to say load driven, or sorry, load driver, so it appears up here. You're next going to go to your squash handle, select it, select squash 1 and say load driven. It's going to bring both of them in here. Say squash 1 and load driven. So there we go. Now we're going to set this up so it's manipulating this guy here. Now, first thing we're going to do is we're going to say back to our this guy here, back to our control interior, and we're going to set our squash value to -1, let's say, -1. So that is the maximum squash. We're going to say that this is when it gets squashed. -1 is when it actually gets squashed. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to factor, and we're going to choose up here, squash. Next thing is choose factor, and go on to this guy here again. Go to squash 1, and we're just going to look at this from the panel's orthographic front, right there, and we're just going to move our factor to some point that we think, oh yeah, that looks like it's the proper amount of squash. Let's say 0.5. This is a number, you're going to eyeball it and choose what this is. Let's say that's the maximum squash I want out of my slime. Boom, -0.5. I'm then going to say key, and it's going to turn this thing here red. The next thing I'm going to do is go back to my interior. I'm going to change this value to 1, just like that. I'm going to go back to my squash 1, and I'm going to change this, let's say, to 0.5, just like that. And afterwards, you're going to say key. Bam. And once you've done that, now whenever we manipulate this squash, let's put this back to 0. Whenever we've manipulated this squash, and I went from -0.5 to 0.5, and that way my 0 point is right in the middle, and I go back to my regular shape. So that's exactly why I chose those two numbers. You can choose any value you want. You can choose -0.6 and 0.6, whatever you want to do, choose those numbers. But now, if we take a look at this squash value, and I manipulate it, boom, 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 I'm squashing and stretching that guy. That's what we wanted. Perfect. We're going to do exactly the same thing now with the jiggle. So now we're going to select off of here. We're going to go in here and we're going to find our jiggle. Let's get in here, and we're going to try and select our jiggle. Bam, got it. We're going to select sine wave right here, and we are going to say load driven. Bam, sine wave 1, load driven. So now with this one here, with the jiggle selected here, and our amplitude selected down here, we're going to again choose our upper and lower values. So let's go to our control thing here. Let's change our jiggle to -1. And that's just going to make it go back and forth. That's all we're doing is making it go back and forth, really. So -1, and then we're going to choose our zoom in. Not that. Zoom in. Boom, that guy. Go into our sine wave, and let's choose a value of how much we want it to the amplitude to be. Let's go with, let's just go with 0.2. This doesn't matter. And again, I chose -1, so I'm going to go with -0.2, -0.2, bam. Just like that. Once I've got my value selected, jiggle, amplitude here, I'm going to say key. Bang, just like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go here, and we're going to select this guy again, and we're going to select our 1, so the value of 1, and then we're going to select our sine wave, and we're going to change this value to 0.2. Again, any value you want, set it, jiggle, amplitude, all good, and say key. Bang, just like that. And now if we take a look at this guy down here, this guy right here, and we do our jiggle, let's put it back to 0. It should be all aligned, so everything's perfectly back the way it was, again, because my value is -0.2 and 0.2. Make sure you go from -x to 2x. And now if I jiggle this guy, I can wiggle this back and forth. Okay, just like that. Perfect. Let's change this value to 0. The last part is the control of this guy over here. And I'm going to do one of these and then let you guys see how to do the rest. Just do the rest off camera. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to choose this guy here. We don't need this window anymore. You can shut it down. I'm going to choose this guy here. And I want this guy to manipulate this C up here, this cluster. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new window. I'm going to say Window. I'm going to say General Editor, is it? Connection Editor. Yep, under General Editors, Connection Editor. Bang, click on that. And we're going to get this new window popping up, the Connection Editor. With this selected, you're going to have loaded the left-hand side, and that's what we want. You're going to select this cluster on the top, and you're going to say Load right hand side, just like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually set it up so that whenever we move this guy here, this thing here is affected. Okay, so I'm gonna scroll through this list. There's a pretty long list here. You're gonna scroll through this list and you're gonna find translate and rotate. So you're gonna find translate and you're gonna select translate. And then on the left hand side you're gonna scroll through and you're gonna find translate, bam, and you're gonna select it. And it's gonna turn this whole thing yellow. That means there's now a link between those two guys. Same thing with rotate. Rotate and rotate. A link between those guys. Perfect. Now watch what happens. When I move this thing here, if I translate it around, that thing up there moves. If I rotate it, that thing there moves. That's exactly what we want. We're going to do that for all three of these other ones. So again, I'm just going to go down here. I'm going to select this guy here. I'm going to say reload left. I'm going to go in here. It's sometimes hard to select these things, so you got to go in there nice and tight. You can try and grab that C. Grab the C. I missed. Sometimes it's really hard to get this thing, to be honest. Select off of it. Select off of it. Actually, I'm going to say show. I'm going to turn off polygons so I don't see it. I'm going to try and just grab my C. Got my C. Turn my polygons back on so I can see them. Okay, and reload right. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Translate, translate, rotate, rotate. Okay, do that for the last one as well. And when you guys are done that, I'm going to come back in a second. I'm going to show you how to tie it all together. Okay, we are now back for the final part of this episode. I think I've said that like 4 times, but this is truly the final part. It went a lot longer than I thought it was going to, but hopefully you guys got all the information. So I went through and I set this up so that this one here now rotates, the top. You can see how it's rotating it there. Yep, this one here rotates the top. Let me put this to 0. This one here rotates the middle or translates the middle. You can either rotate or translate. You can see how it's moving it there. So that's why I use this for the jiggle, because it actually worked a lot better. And this one here rotates and moves the bottom, just like that. So that's exactly what we wanted, and hopefully you guys did that on your own. I showed you the first 2. Hopefully you guys did the last one by yourself. Now it comes time to tie it all together. You're probably thinking like, wow, you're rotating this, but nothing's happening to my cube. And why is nothing happening to the cube? Let me show you what we want to do now. What we want to do is we want to go through and we want to select our different objects. So I'm going to start with, let's say, squash. I'm going to select the actual physical cube. Select the physical cube of the jiggle. Select the physical cube of the mass movement. And then finally select the physical cube of our slime exterior. And I'm going to go to, under animation, I'm going to go to create deformers. I'm going to go to blend shape. I'm going to give it a name. Let's call this slime exterior blends. That way you can, if you want to make an interior one, you can. And I'm going to say create. When I do, it's going to open up this thing over here, a new window, which is my blend shape editor. And you can see that right now these things here are all set. Squash, sign, and mass movement are all set to 0. You want to turn these values all the way up, all the way to 1, and you're just going to leave them there. With the other blend shapes we did, we actually went through and we animated these things here. We moved them up and down to make the facial expressions. We do not want to do that with an active blend. An active blend actively changes the other component, and then those changes appear on our actual physical character. Let me close this window off. I don't need it anymore. And with all those values turned up to 1, like I just showed you, now when I do, let's say, our squash, watch what happens. Boing, 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 boing. Both of them are moving. Right? Both are moving. They actually move each other. Let me put that back to 0 because I think I left it at something. Yep. Same thing with the jiggle. Jiggle, 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 jiggle. Everything is moving. And lastly, each one of these guys here, what do you think is going to happen? That's right, everything moves just like that. Super sexy. You've got yourselves an active moving slime with an active blend shape. And that's the whole point of this. I wanted to show you guys active blend shapes. So I hope you guys understood that. I hope everything worked out really well for you. And if you have any questions, as usual, please let me know. You can now move this guy into your location. That's my ground node. Sorry, with my this thing. You can move it into location, and wherever you move these things here, you can use your active blend shapes, and they'll all keep on working. Okay, everyone, so that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments, and I will try and get to every single one. If you enjoyed this episode, and I really hope you did, make sure you give me a thumbs up. It really drives me on and helps me keep on creating. And if you haven't done so, take a second and subscribe. Have yourselves a great day.